Well, thanks everybody for joining. We have an interesting panel for you today. We're going to talk about optimizing policy and compliance program and also managing the volume and velocity of regulatory changes that are happening. What I'll do is I'll have the panel members introduce themselves, and I would also suggest that let's keep this session interactive because it's all about you. It's all about the members who are attending. We want to make sure you get the maximum out of it. So if you have any questions, there are members in the room who are walking around with the mics, so they will hand over the mic to you and ask the question. So Jeff, let's start with you.
All right, thank you, Super. My name is Jeff Horvath. I am the Chief Compliance Officer for Fitch Ratings. For those of you not in the financial services business, Fitch Ratings provides credit ratings and research on governments, entities, issuers, and securities around the world. We have operations in 25 or so different countries. We are separately regulated in each one of those countries, which makes our job a bit more challenging. Prior to Fitch Ratings, and I've been here for about 2.5 years, I spent about 15 years with a large investment bank in various different compliance roles, both in the US and Europe. Before that, I spent a number of years at law firms practicing financial services regulation, focusing on banks, broker-dealers, and hedge funds. And as you can imagine, my comments today will no doubt be through the lens of a regulated entity, a regulated activity. So look forward to spending the next hour with you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Supra, and thank you, Jeff. My name is Michelle Thomas, and I'm an Assistant Vice President with AT&T. And over the past 21 years that I've been with the company, I've held a variety of roles in our finance, organization, tax, and controllers. I've also been in our external affairs organization where I spent about 6 years in Washington, D.C. advocating before the Federal Communications Commissions on regulatory matters. Also advocated before them on enforcement matters impacting our company. And I've also spent some time lobbying with the state legislature. So I have both the regulatory and the legislative experience for our company. For the past 4 years, I've been in our Chief Compliance Office. And so in that capacity, I manage our government sponsors program, antitrust and competition. I manage all of our enforcement activities for a variety of regulatory agencies. And most recently, I have been building a compliance program with one of our newest operating entities, data analytics and advertising. So that brings kind of a wealth of financial aspect, regulatory and legislative, as well as oversight in the compliance area.
Thanks. Welcome.
Good morning. My name is Tatiana Kalita. I'm the AVP of Risk Governance with Great West Life Assurance Company. It's one of the 3 largest companies in Canada, and we are a part of a bigger holding company with interests in life and health insurance, reinsurance, asset management, and a number of other things. So we are global in nature, although our base is in Canada. We have a big presence in Europe as well as quite a large presence here in the United States. My job is in the second line of defense for the risk function, so most likely I will have a slightly different perspective on how compliance is done, but we very closely operate with compliance and other oversight functions. So hopefully my perspective is not going to be too much off. In my previous life, so I've been with the company for around 3 years. In my previous life, I was building the first and the second line of defense functions for the Royal Bank of Canada, which is the largest bank in Canada, and it was in the operational risk and technology risk management. Prior to coming to Canada, I'm originally from Belarus. I opened 2 medium services companies, which are still successful operating, one in Belarus, one in Canada. And I was serving in the advisory capacity to the US government, US embassy. So I was advising on physical security issues as well as political issues. And last but not the least, or my first job was with the, bless you, with the largest retailer of high fashion and premium cosmetic brands. So diverse experience, but when I'm reminiscing about my how I ended up in risk, which everybody thinks is one of the most boring areas in the organization, and I don't believe so. But I think that every job that I had was somewhat affiliated with how you manage risk, different aspects of risk. That's why I personally love operational risk, and I believe that operational risk and compliance are just two sides of one medal, which is multifaceted. Sorry for the longer introduction.
That was well deserved. Thank you. Welcome. As you can see, there's a lot of expertise here. Definitely, we are going to get different perspectives, different thoughts as we go through the questions. But as I mentioned, like, I highly encourage that you all also ask some questions. And I encourage you all also to see if anybody has interesting points of view. Okay? So let's get started with the first one. One of the consistent themes that we see in the GRC space is that the regulations are changing at a rapid pace. Right? You all have seen it, well, I've seen it for so many years. What do you think are some of the best practices out there that you would pass on to the members here? Tatyana, probably will start with you, your insights.
Absolutely. So from our perspective, from our company's perspective, there is no one good way to manage the regulatory change. And if I were to tell you that we in our company know how to do it perfectly, I would be lying. But I strongly believe that there are a number of aspects from which we need to be approaching managing regulatory changes. Number one, we need to make sure that we have a very strong bond with the regulatory authorities. Maybe bond is too light of a word, but a very good interaction. And going back to your previous life in terms of lobbying, in terms of making sure that we are as transparent as possible with the regulatory authorities. By doing this, we're making sure that we understand what are the upcoming trends. We are lobbying for ourselves. We are being listened to when new regulatory initiatives are being planned. And in Canada, we have a consortium through which the superior regulatory body in Canada is listening to our concerns, our needs. What we also do is we have regularly quarterly meeting with the regulators to make sure that we explain to them our concerns, and they are surprisingly listening to us, and they're talking to us, they're coming back with the feedback. So this is one alley. The other alley is making sure that your organizational structure in compliance is robust enough to ensure that you cover not just national but also supranational regulatory initiatives if you're operating on the global scale. For example, if you are focused heavily on the central compliance piece, so you have people, a lot of people in the central compliance organization, you do not have a good enough penetration in the first line of defense. You do not have the business unit compliance officers, or you do not have an infrastructure that is built into the first line of defense. For example, small centers of excellence or expertise that can be focusing on different areas of compliance, like privacy or AML. Then it's going to be very hard to catch up on the regulatory initiatives that are coming from different countries. And last but not the least, I do think that the availability and the presence of such systems as MetricStream and other systems that are available on the market is really important, because we can feed the regulatory initiatives in bulk. We can download this information into our systems, and then through the usage of lineage and tracking lineage from the regulatory requirements into the processes, into the controls, we can see how we can adapt and how we can modify our processes and controls to fit the needs of the regulatory requirements.
Michelle, would you like to comment, especially in the telecom space? Do you see a similar thing?
Well, you know, I can talk about the telecom space, but as a company, AT&T, we're in so many different lines of business. And so just not to repeat, but to echo some of the things that Tatyana said, is advocacy is really important. You want to be on the forefront of regulatory legislative change. So the relationships you develop with those regulators, I think it's key, that's important. And you may not have that insight from a compliance or risk perspective, but working with your external affairs organization so that they know and understand what the risks are is important. And that you know, you don't go into the regulator after something has been enacted. you want to be part of the conversation. You want to be part of helping to shape that from a policy standpoint. So developing those relationships up front, I think, are key. And in that ongoing dialogue between the compliance risk areas and that front line, the business units, they understand what those risks are, and they call you in early so that you can help shape that dialogue. I'd say participate early in that rulemaking process so that you can then assess how is it going to impact our organization, and you're part of that dialogue as well. And you have to watch the news, you have to read a lot. There's so many changes, and don't just pay attention to what's happening in your industry or with what's happening with your company, because the trends are going to really, at some point, it's going to come back your way. Don't just pay attention to what's happening domestically either. There's lots of global aspects that we have to be aware of. So it's a challenge.
It is
keeping up with it. But I think with dialogue, with often communications, and those relationships building early, you'll set up.
And Jeff, what do you find out there? I'm assuming that this problem statement gets amplified depending on the number of countries that you all are operating in.
It gets amplified depending on the number of countries, the number of regulations, the number of industries in which you're operating. But there's also a second dimension, we touched on it a little bit, and that is there's the formal rulemaking process. There's the regulator comes out, they have a rule, they solicit comment from the industry, and that sort of goes to the implementation phase. But a lot of the regulatory engagement we have is a result of sort of implicit regulatory concerns, which ultimately lead to an expectation from a regulator. And a lot of big scandals in the past, take LIBOR or FX or some of the research settlements, it wasn't a specific regulation that resulted in the issue, but rather a regulatory expectation of conduct that an institution or institutions, in hindsight, didn't meet. So in a lot of ways, where I think the biggest challenge is understanding what's not been written, what's not been socialized for comment, but yet still important to a regulator. The most recent one is sort of cybersecurity. There's a few little cybersecurity laws going on, but I get questions from many, many regulators about cybersecurity. What are you doing? How are you addressing it? Where's this coming from? What are your standards? There are industry standards out there, but there's a lot that goes on that isn't necessarily written into law or regulation that we need to be aware of, that we need to address, and we need to make sure our institutions are capable of managing.
Yep. And you bring out a very interesting point, right? I think in the kickoff session, Michael, our CEO, talked about it. It's not the known unknowns that we will fall for, right? It's unknown unknowns that we'll fall for. So regulators are doing their part, especially we see this in the technology space too. Yeah. We have Uber and we have drones flying around, and they all went ahead before even the regulators came in, right? So we makes sense for us to look internally first. Along the same lines, do want to see how do you assess the potential impact of regulations within your organizations, and what steps do you take to make sure that you are compliant?
Can we keep on this one?
Yeah.
Sure,
Yeah.
happy to do that. I'd love to say that there was some formula or algorithm that you can plug this into and out spits the result as to what you need to do about it, how you need to do about it. It's a lot more about judgment. But I would bucket them into a couple different categories. One is new regulations that impact your compliance or controls environment. So this might be disclaimers or certifications and the like. And how does that change your compliance and control environment? And the persons or the groups that are involved or engaged in that sort of discussion and analysis might form one set of your organization. The more material ones are those that will actually impact how your firm is conducting business. You're no longer allowed to do something. So for example, the Focal Rule in Dodd-Frank, banks are no longer allowed to conduct proprietary trading activities. Or something about Brexit, there's certain things you can and you can't do, and it has such a fundamental impact on the business, that really then needs to form part of the corporate strategy to address that. So in terms of how I approach these, it's really around trying to understand what part of the organization is impacted. Is it really something which we can manage and handle and address through the control functions with some engagement, with some education, some involvement from other lines of defense? Or is it really so transformative to the business that it really needs to be owned and led and managed by some of the businesses because their strategy needs to change, and in that role, compliance becomes a facilitator, an educator, an advisor, and an advocate, but doesn't necessarily own the change process. So there's a lot of ways you can answer the question you asked, but unfortunately there isn't really an easy way you can bucket these into high, medium, low.
Yeah.
And you can give it a try, but everything's a little bit different.
It depends upon the initial assessment, I believe, that which organization is getting impacted, what sort of impact. Michelle, what are your thoughts on?
So I think it is key to identify who, what business is being impacted by that new regulation or legislation. And it goes to the first dialogue we had about understanding what's coming down the pipeline, so you can then early engage that business unit leader so they can assess what is the impact on their business. So the first thing is having that business operation acknowledge that, hey, we own this and we own it through implementation. And from a compliance standpoint, we make sure that they have the right plan in place to implement the new regulation, but they own it, they own the implementation. And once that goes through their process, then from an oversight standpoint, from a compliance standpoint, we're able to then determine, did they fill all the gaps that they need to? Did they comply with the actual requirements of the particular regulation that's being enacted? From a compliance standpoint, we look at things that are high risk. So we're not in, the mix of implementing every single regulation. And so there are certain regulations or certain things that the business unit has to do without the particular oversight of a compliance or a risk standpoint. So identifying what's high risk, making sure it's fully implemented within the business unit, that they have covered all the gaps that needs to be covered is really important for us to engage with that business unit.
And being in the second line of defense, Tatyana, what are your thoughts? We often see that nowadays the compliance landscape has changed. We all talked about handing over the work to the third line of defense and so on and so forth, right? Do you feel that these regulatory changes that are happening gives us enough routes, enough handles to go into the organization and target the impacted areas quickly?
It's a tough question because each organization would answer differently. We all want to hope that we do have enough leverage with the first line of defense, and the first line of defense understands second line processes enough to say, yes, we need to adapt to the regulatory changes, we need to do X, Y, and Z, and then everybody's going to be happy, including the regulators. But unfortunately, this is not the case. In most cases, what would happen is if you do not have enough first line penetration and understanding by the first line how the current regulatory regime affects their operations, basically, this is the regulation 1, it affects my process A, B, and C, and my control 1 through 20. If you don't have this almost like a data mapping made, then it's really hard to say how the new regulatory changes or how the changes in the existing regulation are affecting the first line processes. When I'm thinking about the regulatory changes and how we are implementing them, again, I'm going to make parallels to what we do in operational risk. It's not dissimilar from the risk and control assessment, because what we would do is we would take the regulatory requirements, compare them, well, very basic, very practical example, compare the regulatory requirements that are new to the old ones if we had a new requirement, and then see what changes need to be made. Recently, OSFI, which is our supreme regulator in Canada, has started planning to introduce a new governance guidelines. So this is the guideline that regulates how the boards need to operate and what they do in the reality. So we just put the two guidelines together and said what makes sense to change, what doesn't make sense to change, because we do not want to create a revolution. We want to evolution, to have an evolution of our processes. And then going back to the point that you're making in terms of deferring things to the third line of defense, I would say maybe on the contrary. Oftentimes what I personally see is compliance is doing a lot of first line activities, especially when we're talking controls testing. Then these first line activities need to start and be owned by the first line, because then the second line function can actually do the job that we're supposed to be doing. We should be thinking about the regulatory requirements. We should be thinking about the best ways how we can streamline the organization into introducing these regulatory requirements. Because right now we're doing bits of third line activities, bits of second line activities, and in many cases a lot of first line activities.
Clearly, there is so much dependency between each other, right? This first line, second line, and third line, and so on, depending on how much effort they're taking in. So, Michelle, if you want to comment on how do they collaborate from a compliance point of view? How do you facilitate that collaboration between these lines of defense?
So I have to tell you first, this is my first MetricStream GRC conference or summit, and the dialogue of first, second, and third line of defense was somewhat new to me. At AT&T, when we talk about first, second, and third line, that level of management. And so like, okay, what exactly is that? So first line being the business unit itself, second line being the governance or oversight compliance, and third line being internal audit. I would add, even for us, we've got probably a 1.5 being our business unit compliance partners, which are really, really key to the work that we do. So one being, the operations, the business unit operations, those that have responsibility for implementing on what those requirements are. We have that relationship with our business unit compliance coordinators who they manage within their operations, ensuring that the compliance aspects, the action plans are developed within their operations. And then they interact quite a bit with us on the Chief Compliance Office. And so I say all three, and also adding internal audit, or four if you use my definitions, are really key to working together to making sure that we're addressing all of the high risks that we've prioritized. We've worked together to identify the risks, agree that these are the risks that needs to be addressed from a compliance or just a company standpoint, and then working collaboratively along all of those lines. One of the things that I like to say the business unit owns and implements from a compliance standpoint, we make sure that there are no gaps in what they're doing. We might do a compliance review, which is a little bit more forward-looking to make sure that those processes are working. And then internal audit will then come along and they'll do a backward-looking, they'll do an audit of internal controls. And our job in compliance is to make sure that when it gets to the internal audit, that it's a low-rated audit. What was the terminology that they used in the last session? It's auditopia.
Auditopia.
That would be our goal, to have auditopia, because we've come along and put all those in place.
So let me actually turn to the audience, right? We have talked about your perspective. I also want to see if you have seen how in your organization the first line, second line, third line collaboration is happening. Please feel free to comment. Anybody like to comment?
Actually, maybe if I could sort of jump in for a second and force a little bit more audience participation here. How many organizations, how many people work for organizations that use the concept of a first, second, and third line? Just by a show of hands, is that something most people do? All right, so I think about half the people in the audience use that concept. For those of you who raise your hands, do you get a sense that each of the different lines of defense knows what that means, knows what their role is, and knows how to interact in that operating model?
I would say yes, but I think they're from the third line that a little bit clearer to define.
Okay. So about half the crowd said, yeah, they had the 3 lines of defense, but only one person said, yeah, we think we understand largely how it works. I think that's really a key component. And one of the biggest challenges when this whole concept came out was it really was a shifting of a responsibility. And the understanding and agreement and acceptance of that first line that, hey, you're a risk owner. You own the risk. Just because it's a law doesn't mean compliance owns the risk. But each of those laws, rules, regulations, and standards has to have a home in the first line of defense, has to have oversight by the second line, and there has to be some sort of holistic review by the third line. The biggest struggle that organizations have is getting the first line of defense in the mindset that they're a risk owner. And that's really something that takes a lot of effort, a lot of coordination, and a lot of collaboration. So if there's one thing you take away is that you really need to drive that message home, because I'll be the first one to admit for my organization that I wouldn't be with my hand up in the air saying we've got it all sorted either, but there's a lot of work that I think all of us can do in that space.
It does, I would second you. It does take a lot of time and effort, and I think on average it takes an organization, a sizable organization, up to 3 years to implement this concept of the 3 lines of defense. But once you have implemented the concept and everybody's happy or they have landed, whether it's the first line, second, and third line, another challenge shows up is that the first line of defense is starting to scream to the second line and to the internal audit saying that there's too much of you. There are way too many interactions that are happening. Internal audit comes to the first line, compliance comes separately, risk comes separately, actuarial, if you have an actuarial function, comes separately, financial management, if they play the oversight function, also comes separately. So now, as we are evolving our compliance and risk practices, I do firmly believe that what we need to start doing is we need to start de-stressing the first line of defense from these uncoordinated interactions. And what we need to do, and what we have started doing in our company, is development of an enterprise risk assessment process where annually the people in the first line will know when different oversight functions and control functions are coming to them, what are the topical requirements for them, and how the model works between the second and the third line, where the third line can leverage the outputs from the second line and not go after the first line as much. The same would go for the oversight functions. How can risk leverage what compliance is doing from the controls testing perspective, from the regulatory change management perspective, so that we do not go after the same people in the first line 2, 3, 4 times within the year. So now this will allow us to increase efficiencies and actually move along this line of optimization. Because when I'm thinking about risk and compliance management, I'm thinking about a road that started with us determining the controls and understanding. So we have some controls that are either risk or compliance related. And then we moved into the defensive compliance and risk management, where we started being more active in terms of complying with the regulatory requirements, identifying our risks. But now it's the high time for us to move into the offensive risk and compliance management, where we're not just passively complying with the regulations, but we are driving the regulatory change. Because let's face it, in most of the cases, especially when we're talking about technology and technological changes like Bitcoin, we, the businesses, we are the drivers, we are the shapers of the current and the future state, and we can tell the regulators who are at the same loss as us what are the best practices. And that's why, going back to the initial points, it's so important to talk to the regulators openly, to express our concerns, to lobby for our interests.
There's a question actually from the audience. Yeah.
No, we do not.
We are in the process of implementing that one, but haven't crossed the finish line yet?
We have started the implementation. Currently, we're implementing the policies module, but we have purchased most of the MetricStream modules, and our compliance group as well as operational risk group are working on the risk assessment module as well as compliance assessment and issue management.
I think it's more to, the question is, when there are regulations out there, how do you figure out which department is getting affected or which organization? As we were looking at one of the responses from you, you did talk about as regulations come in, we do have to look at the organizations that are getting impacted. So if you want to comment on that. Go ahead.
Sure. I mean, from a systems standpoint, it's really about establishing what's the right data, what's the right content. And regulators have RSS feeds, they have email newsletters, there are industry publications. The challenge isn't necessarily getting a hold of the regulation and streaming it into the system, but rather how do you boil that down to what's relevant to you, and if what's relevant to you, then how do you send it out? Part of what we're looking to do in our operating model is we now have it coming into the system and flowing into the system. We are able to do a little bit through machine learning isn't the right word, it sounds far too sophisticated for that, but through more intelligent searches and queries to eliminate a lot of the noise. But you don't want to go too aggressive in that, so you're left with a series of content which might be relevant. And at this point, it's really we have someone centrally within compliance taking a look at that and doing, if you will, an effective triage. And after that triage, it then gets routed back to whatever local compliance officer is relevant, depending on where this new law or rule is coming out of, or to the extent that it's something that might impact finance or it might impact human resources or another function. And this is a process in which we're currently evolving. You can use other modules, such as the issue management module, to establish that as a deliverable, set the owner through there, and work through that process. But as I say, we haven't gotten all the way through the finish line in that one yet.
And this is something that we are also seeing as other customers who are implementing these applications. There is a maturity curve, right? There is a distance that needs to be covered with these regulations come in. Earlier on, at least the good news is that it's all coming into the system. Then if it is in front of us, we will also solve it. If it is not in front of us, then it's out of our sight and it will be out of our mind. So once it is there, then you start off with identifying the initial governance framework or the departments that are getting affected, and then you roll it out. Slowly you start stamping other areas that are getting impacted. So if it helps. Then.
I'll just say we have kind of a homegrown, internally developed system within my company, and you can imagine we have a lot of regulation, legislation that impacts our company, and so our external affairs organization, they are feet on the street, they work directly with those regulators and those legislators, and so they have that first notice of things that are changing within the industry. Once things are moving through, whether it's the legislative process or the regulatory process, it's then input into a system that we have. It's owned by our external affairs organization. We have visibility from a compliance standpoint into that, that system. And we have had that early conversation with them as to if it's a network issue, if it's a data protection issue, here's where it goes. And again, those people in the business have some input into shaping the regulation or legislation as it goes through. Once it has been enacted, then again, I talked a little bit about the acknowledgement by the business unit. Yes, we know it. We've had legal help to define what it means, to interpret what it means, and then that business unit takes a hold of owning implementation of that. So it is a system that's used. We have visibility into it. Is it perfect? One of the things that we're finding out as we grow and expand as a company, there are governing agencies that we have not previously had much insight into, and certainly don't have that advocacy relationship. So making sure that that system captures everything is a challenge, and one that we're working through to make sure we do get that, gets assigned to the right place, and then we have the right oversight based on prioritization of those.
I think there was one more question for the audience.
So, here's my question. So for regulatory changes, how does that work with the policy changes?
So what we do is actually we have a well-controlled policy management lifecycle, and through this policy management lifecycle, we have a central team that is responsible for ensuring that the top policies are properly updated. And as a part of we have the person who is responsible for the overall program, then we have the working group who have the representatives from risk, compliance, internal audit, first line of defense, depending on the policy, of course, right? But the core second line and third line people do not really change. So once the compliance people who are a part of the policy working group hear about the change that potentially needs to be reflected in the policies, they will take a look at what policies this change does or does not affect. Because from our perspective, when we write policies, the policies are principle-based. We do not expect that with changes in the regulatory regimes, we will have to introduce some changes, because we do not say, okay, and our enterprise risk management policy or compliance risk management policy is aligned to these 10 pages of regulatory requirements, because that would be a nightmare. But if you develop the principle-based policies, then the actual regulatory requirements have the trickle-down effect in the standards, procedures, and guidelines, which are much closer to the business lines. And then going back to the previous question, this is very well tied into how you determine what are the functions that are being affected by the new regulatory requirements, and what are the business lines, because it's then at this intersection of the second line compliance person and the 1Bs, the business unit compliance officers, right? As well as the functional areas, for example, whether it's technology, information security, or IT change management. These people will know exactly what controls are being affected, what business units are being affected, what service you have in different areas that will be affected by changes that will have to be implemented. Is it answering your question? Happy to talk to you about policies, because I kind of have a love-hate relationship with the subject.
I think I have time for one more question that we can go through. I'd like to change the gears a little bit. Let's talk about profit and purpose. This morning, Gunjan talked about this, balancing act between these. As you try to balance profit and purpose to drive responsible business and so on, we often see that compliance is the first one that will come into the picture if something goes wrong. It's difficult about it. So how do you think compliance playing the role in this landscape, providing the best guidance to the organization that they can balance profit and purpose? Go ahead, Tatyana, if you want to play that.
Well, you cannot blame everything on compliance. Let's start with that.
You're from compliance.
I think realistically, when we're talking about faults, deficiencies, bad use cases that each of our companies will have, I would start with the culture of the organization. You cannot blame the chief compliance officer for an advisor who sold securities that should not be sold to a certain type of people, right? Or who have sold insurance that is the wrong insurance for you. But what you can do is you can definitely review the culture of your organization, because from my perspective, culture or risk culture is what you do when nobody's looking. And this is when all the bads and the uglies are coming out, right? That's why instead of us trying to penalize, or regulators trying to penalize compliance officers or risk officers or the companies for the wrongdoings of one individual person, they need to take a closer look at what is your culture? How do you define your culture? Do you have any cultural metrics, parameters that you do assessments? And this is where Chief Compliance Officer and compliance function does play a huge role, because all of us have the code of conduct. The code of conducts are being reviewed annually, right? Do you have metrics associated with people who do not do the review? Do you have metrics that talk about your staff retention? Do you understand fast enough when your staff turnover is too much, and when is this too much, right? So all these things that are talking about how much is the fraud rate in your company? Do you see the instances of collusion? Do you see instances of AML activities on a large scale? So all these parameters, when you put them together, they determine what is your risk culture, because everybody thinks risk culture is something nebulous. From my perspective, you have to try to quantify risk culture or culture. Then it starts it starts giving you the information that you need to avoid these bads and the uglies, and to avoid the chief compliance officers being penalized.
Michelle, yourself.
Well, I think defining the return on investment in compliance is always a very difficult thing, and the value, we know the value when it's not there, when, having to manage our enforcement actions, when there is a lapse, when there is non-compliance, you know exactly what that price tag is based on the fee. And so you want to be able to define that really well, so that as we invest more in the compliance area and the integrated systems, you can make that business case. And it's a hard thing to do when you're not looking at some sort of infraction. So it's a hard thing to do. One of the things that my boss says is that government's going to be government, regulators are going to regulate, and as compliance people, we have to be very vigilant in what we do. And so I think being able to make the case for the investment in compliance is really a critical thing that we have to do. We have to do better in the industry and be able to bring that to the business as we continue to invest. And where we invest in what we need to do is, it's all in technology, it's all in data analytics, it's being able to look at the metrics to be able to value the success that we bring, or the value we bring to the business. And that's, again, making that business case for technology. We have to be able to identify when there is some sort of lapse before a regulator figures that out, or before we're so far down the road. So what are the sort of systems that we're going to put in place to automate that, raising the red flag when something goes awry, so we can detect what's going in there. So that's how
Jeff, we welcome your comments also
Sure,
on this topic.
Keep it brief. I know we're running out of time.
Absolutely,
Compliance is a cost center. It's a burden. It's an overhead. It's the just say no function, right? Traditional concepts of compliance. You've all heard it in some fashion or other. I'm sure there's a lot of other descriptors out there that are used. You need to change that dialogue. And one of the ways I found successful in trying to change that dialogue is trying to understand, what are the business's strategic objectives? What are they trying to achieve? And how can I align what I'm trying to achieve in a supportive way and demonstrate that? One of the exercises I worked on with my team was, for each one of our strategic objectives, let's talk about, what does compliance do to support that? How can we add value to that? But it can't stop there. It can't stop with your internal objectives with compliance. That then has to be communicated, and senior management has to understand that, yes, there are some things that they might want to do that they can't, and vice versa. But there is a value proposition for compliance. It does support the strategic objectives. It does help with the reputation of the company. It does avoid costs and fines. But the more you can demonstrate that you're part of the value add to an organization and its objectives, the more you can move your organization down that right path and to develop the sort of culture that my colleagues here have discussed.
Yeah. If you don't mind, just one more note. Right now, when we're looking at different areas of compliance, I think it's starting to become a little bit easier to quantify technology compliance requirements, because now, since you have all this research that tells you, okay, a breach of one record will cost you $300-400, then you can see how many records can be potentially breached, and then you can develop the scenarios, quantitative scenarios that will tell you, okay, worst case scenarios, this is how much we're going to lose by not doing this, or by not implementing this compliance process. I mean, it's very simplistic, but we're starting to see the trend where we start seeing the quantification of the compliance efforts that so far have not been adequately quantified.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate your insights and going through the details about your organization. And I hope the audience also enjoyed the panel discussion. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you all.